Yes, yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be with friends of Sligo Creek. It's good to see some familiar faces, some people I've known in Takoma Park for a long, long time. Hey, Barbara, Ann Baker, Ann Kaiser, others. Really great to be here. Um, Most people know me as sort of the climate guy, and I have been obsessed with climate change for quite a while. I founded my organization, Chesapeake Climate Action Network, almost 20 years ago. I'm the executive director. We're involved in clean energy legislation and policies in Maryland, Virginia, DC, and now on Capitol Hill. Mostly, promoting wind and solar and electric vehicles. Not as much the tree aspect, but I work in the old world, work in the Takoma Business Center, that ugly high rise in the middle of Takoma Park, which when you're in it, it's not ugly because you can't see the building. So we're on the seventh floor. We have a great view overlooking Northwest DC. And for years, there's been this tree in the distance that about 10 blocks from my office, twice as tall as all the trees around it. And for years, I thought one day I'm going to go find that beautiful grandfather tree and say a prayer and thank creation for this amazing tree. And then when COVID came and I had more time to take walks in the morning, my wife and I finally walked over and found this 150-year-old tulip poplar, amazing tree. And it was as advertised, giant, beautiful, wonderful in the middle of Northwest DC. But it was literally choking from an incredible matrix of English ivy and Asian bittersweet and all these vines that were killing it. And I was amazed and sad and decided to do something about it. So I took a pruning saw, asked the people who lived there if I could cut the vines, and I did. It took like 20 minutes to save this 150-year-old tree. And that just sort of turned me around. After that first tree, once you see trees dying from invasive vines, you can't unsee it. And so I began to realize this is a really big problem throughout DC and Takoma Park, and someone should do something about it. Mature trees sequester at least a ton of carbon per year, I think. And when they die, they cost you $3,000 to $10,000 to take down. So why would you want to let it die? But people just don't see it. They don't see these trees dying in their midst. I wasn't seeing it until I had this conversion moment. And that's why, with the help of Kit Gage, hey, Kit, good to see you. We started last spring trying to raise awareness. I did a story in the Takoma newsletter with photographs. I mean, we took photographs across Takoma Park, including photographs of like a house with solar panels on the front roof in Takoma Park, because they're very climate aware and trying to, reduce carbon emissions. And in the same yard, there's a 100-year-old tree dying from vines that's sequestering a lot more carbon than those solar panels will avoid in the same photograph. Photographs of pampered, newly planted trees with the green water bags and the guy wires and the deer fence around it being planted. And within 20 feet, there's a 50-year-old tree of the same species dying from invasive vines. People aren't seeing it. And so I thought, well, we know a lot of people are committed to planting trees, including our city of Takoma Park. It's great. That's a good idea. But if you go on Takoma Park's page, public, the page, I forget the name of the department, public works page, you'll see all kinds of stuff about planting trees, how to care for newly planted trees, how important trees are, and nothing about saving trees from invasive vines. And so last summer, I just, using the CCAN email list in Takoma Park, started inviting people to meet at the food co-op on Saturday mornings at 8:30. And last summer, there was a core group of like 5 of us who must have saved about 700 to 800 trees in Takoma Park. But I realized to get really serious about this, we had to have some kind of baseline. We have no idea if 700, 800 trees, was that half the invasive trees or trees dying from invasive vines? We didn't think so, because there were a lot more that we could see in Sligo Creek, on private property, on school grounds. And so I thought, why don't we do a survey? We need a baseline. We need to know what the real problem is. So I asked my executive assistant at CCAN, my assistant, to find out what other cities and counties or or jurisdictions have done to do surveys. Because I thought, well, what we need to do is like Google Maps. We need to have a human being walk at all 36 miles of streets and roads in Takoma Park, and literally visually in the winter, when you can see these evergreen, especially English ivy, when you can see them in backyards and side streets, just do a visual inventory, document it on an iPhone, create a database so we know what the baseline was. So I asked my assistant, find out how other cities have done this, counties. And he looked and he looked and he looked and could not find any evidence anywhere on the internet in the United States of a city or a county that did what we wanted to do. And that is just walk or bike and visually document all the trees injured by invasive vines. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that this simple, basic idea had literally never been done before. And that's when I thought, well, somebody ought to do it. We put out a request for someone knowledgeable to do this survey. Jesse Buff, my good friend, fellow former Peace Corps volunteer, who had worked with CCAN as a writer and researcher before. He applied. He was eminently qualified, had done invasive vine work with Rock Creek Conservancy and other groups, was a weed warrior. And so Jesse set out and to do this survey, and I'll let him tell you more about it. But now we have this survey, and the number of trees he documented was way more than we thought. It was almost 5,000, and we think it's an undercount. And so we knew we really had to also step up our game in terms of volunteers in addressing the issue. And so since early April, we have been meeting again at the co-op. Thankfully, we have more volunteers. We have a better system, which Jesse can tell you more about. And we're just trying to take this to scale in Takoma Park, not just for Takoma Park, but to create a model for other cities and counties across the country. We hope this can be a microcosm of one city that came together using very limited resources and a lot of motivation and volunteers and students looking for student service hours and all the rest, and that we can take care of all 5,000 trees in Takoma Park and show other jurisdictions how to do it. So that's the big idea. It started with me at the beginning of COVID a year ago, walking to this grandfather tree, blown away and having my ability to see this problem completely change. Fast forward to now, Jesse Buff, who will tell you about the first ever survey, walking survey of the kind he did in Takoma Park. So, Jesse.
Thanks, Mike. Can people see my screen? All right, let me get situated here. Thanks, Mike. Yeah, so it's hard to follow an intro like that because now we're going to kind of get in the weeds and get a little wonky. But I do want to add that I believe that I walked way more than 36 miles, the official mileage count of Takoma Park streets, because I often had to, walk back and forth in front of one house. I had to go around behind the houses to look at them and see what was lurking in the back. So, I don't know how many miles I walked, but it was probably, at least double that. Anyway, in the cold of February, but it was fun. It was really interesting. The unfortunate thing about doing it that time of year is I didn't really interact with too many people out there, not too many people to ask me what I was doing, but that's probably for the better in some ways. Anyway, so I'm going to give a little background on the issue, mainly for those not steeped in these issues. I'll present the methodology of the study and our results and some observations, and then leave some time for questions. So many of you know, this is an overhead map of Takoma Park. Many of you know sort of the benefits of the urban forest. So we're talking about vines, we're talking about, mature trees. Writ large, we're talking about the urban forest. And what the urban forest does and the trees within that forest is, and this is CCAN's interest primarily, which is that these big trees sequester carbon. And as Mike alluded to earlier, big trees sequester or uptake exponentially more carbon than smaller trees. We know that they filter air and water, they control stormwater, amongst other environmental services. They conserve energy for our houses and buildings. They provide wildlife habitat, and that is a critical thing in a place. This is critical for our discussion tonight because the big trees that exist in our yards provide a critical link between our parks, our valued parks here in Montgomery County, such as Sligo, Sligo Creek and Long Branch and other parks. And then socially, these trees in the urban forest also reduce noise. They provide a place for humans to recreate. They strengthen our social cohesion, and of course, they add economic value to our communities. And then just to give a little bit of background on invasive vines, I think we all know that they're bad, but how they're bad, I'll just talk about briefly. You know, they smother trees and shrubs, they block light, they shade out and outcompete lower growing plants, you know, those baby trees that want to be bigger trees someday. They inhibit wildlife movement. They're often not of much value to wildlife either. They make trees more vulnerable to blowing over in storms due to their added weight. And then they also climb, twist, and strangle trees and shrubs and eventually girdle them as well and kill them by cutting off the flow of water and nutrients. And there's really a double-edged sword when we're talking about climate change and invasive plants, because climate change, it's thought that climate change is really going to positively affect many invasive plant species. And so that's only going to make our problem worse. It's going to stress trees that are already stressed by vines. We saw this recently with the sudden oak decline that we had in this area, which was maybe not directly related to vines, but it was almost certainly related to climate change. And vines are going to further stress those trees, and there's going to be more vines. So it's really a double-edged sword over time with climate change, and vines are only going to add to that pressure. Takoma Park, as many people know, is a tree city. It has a robust urban canopy of 60%, which is a lot higher than most Maryland cities of this size and bigger. About 74% of trees in Takoma Park are on residential property, and 13% are on rights of way, you know, public areas that are, you know, to the sides of roads. About 10% is on Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission property, so that's Montgomery Parks. And then about 2% is on city property. And I don't actually know how the 13 versus 2% breaks down, because I think a lot of the rights of way are city property as well. But no matter right now. Here's a map of Takoma for those of you unfamiliar with its geography. It's divided up into 6 different political wards, each with an elected leader on the city council. Sligo Creek runs from the northern tip there, basically down through the city, flowing. I can't really show you with my arrow here, but flowing to the southeast, and then Long Branch Park, a tributary of Sligo Creek, flows in just above that. Most of the houses in Takoma, or the highest concentration of houses, the biggest number of residential single-family homes are in wards 1, 2, and 3. So 1 on the upper left, 3 on the bottom, and 2. And you can kind of see the density as compared to the other wards. So how do we get started? Mike alluded to some of this. You know, I got hired to kind of lead this assessment. I worked with other CCAN staff to develop a simple Google form where I could just go out there and start logging all these trees. It was pretty easy. I had it on my iPhone. I went house to house, park to park, you know, schools, businesses all over town, logging the wards, the addresses, property types, what type of, you know, the things that I just mentioned, as well as any notes that I had, like if the vines were more to the back of a yard, to the left, or, if it would be hard to see them. Because this was wintertime, I was really targeting some of the most offensive vines, and those are the evergreen vines, and they're also the easiest to see. If I had to do this survey right now, it would take 10 times as long because I would be, my view would be blocked, and also I'd be confused by the deciduous vines that lose their leaves. So most of what I logged were English ivy and winter creeper, these evergreen vines that you can see all year. But I did, in some cases, log tangles of probably porcelain berry and Japanese honeysuckle as well. And for the purposes of the study, what I considered to be an affected tree, the tree that I would log that was being affected by vines, were those that I considered to be moderately to severely affected by vines. The trees that, if no action was taken, will succumb to vines within 5 to 7 years. Usually trees with vines present at the bottom with small tendrils at their base, I didn't count those. I counted them as affected by virtue of the tree's relative size. So if it was an oak, a small oak that will eventually be a canopy tree, but it was being overwhelmed by vines, it would probably succumb in a relatively short time frame. I counted that. Or if it was a ton of vines covering a large tree that I thought was significantly unhealthy for that tree. And then as I went through, I marked trees and properties as priorities for future work, which is the work that we're doing now. I called them priority if there was a significant number of affected trees on the property, or there was at least one mature tree that was severely impacted, or both of those things. One of the difficulties I faced as I went through logging all these trees was seeing whose property these trees were on. I wasn't asking people to come on their properties in most cases, so I was just logging this information from the sidewalks. Of course, public parks I went into and was able to do a more accurate assessment, but oftentimes it was hard to tell where a tree was growing, if it was on one person's yard or another. So there might have been double counting in some cases, but I do feel that we probably undercounted the trees overall, because there were probably a lot of trees that I couldn't see because of buildings blocking my view. So on to our results. As Mike mentioned earlier, I counted close to 5,000 trees, 4,850 trees. This is just kind of a simple graph of the number of units surveyed within that category. So single family homes, apartments, parks, other public and government, businesses, churches, schools, hospitals, and one nursing home. And then the respective amount of trees per property type. And you can see that homes lead the way, obviously, and that tracks with what I mentioned earlier, was that 75% of tree canopy in Takoma Park is on residential property. But I think a surprising number was this 88 apartment buildings that had 607 trees, or 607 affected trees. Obviously, parks was a huge one. That was second behind residential properties, and homes and parks actually count for 74% of all the affected trees in the study. But you can see that proportionally, those apartments are pretty significant as well. This is just a simple graph of the number of affected trees and the number of surveyed properties per ward. So as I mentioned earlier, the most homes, the concentrations of homes were in wards 1, 2, and 3, and you can see that on the right. That also tracks, I don't have the slide with me, but in the report you can see it lines up actually quite nicely with the amount of trees per ward, and the tree cover per ward. A tree canopy assessment was done a few years ago. So it makes sense that the more trees that you have, the more vines you're going to have. There are about 3,770 single-family homes in Takoma. 21% of them, or 820, had affected trees. There was not a lot of difference between the different wards in the number of trees per home. I thought we might see that, but it was not really significant. I counted 438 properties as priority, and that counts all property types. The highest number of priority properties was in Ward 3, actually, but the greatest proportion of priority properties, 72%, was in Ward 4, and that's probably because of all the apartment buildings that I mentioned earlier that have a significant amount of affected trees. This is a map of basically distribution of trees that kind of maps the hot spots across town. You can see the hot spots are red and orange, basically the places that have the most amount of affected trees. And you can see, it's hard for me to point out. I can't really use a pointer here, unfortunately. You can see a line across Maple Avenue of all those apartment buildings. You can see concentrations in the parks as well, the red dots in Sligo and in Long Branch, and other properties like Takoma, Piney Branch Park, near the schools. The other thing that is probably evident here, or it's evident to me, but may not be evident to everyone, is that the rights of way kind of jump out as well as orange dots as well. And also you can see that the dots align nicely along major roads, which also may overlap with the number of apartment buildings. I think less obvious from this map are the hot spots where you had a lot of trees kind of at the borders of properties. So between yards and parks, or between apartments and public areas and park areas, or between businesses and yards. For our purposes as Friends of Sligo Creek, the number of affected trees in Sligo and Long Branch combined was 617, and that's probably an undercount because I was doing a lot of it at a distance. I'd say one of the most interesting things that emerged from this was just kind of seeing these hot spots and these concentrations that I mentioned earlier. And I think what really defines a lot of them is that they're kind of like, I guess I'd call them no man's land. You know, these are places that are borders between properties. Ownership may be in doubt. You know, people may say, those aren't my trees, they're the other guys, or they're just kind of neglected by, you know, they might be difficult to access by weed warriors or other volunteers. And, you know, there are these rights of way that are kind of difficult to get to. They're on the sides of roads with steep slopes, things like that, or they're just not obviously someone's trees. And I think that's one of the things that really jumped out. There's often, I would suspect that there's unclear ownership between properties sometimes, you know, where people say, you know, those aren't mine, as I mentioned earlier. I saw that quite a bit in areas bordering Sligo, where you had affected trees right up against the park, and it wasn't really clear to me, at least, whether they were on park property or on the apartment's property. And I think, to give another good example for those who know Takoma, there's an area between Piney Branch Elementary and Takoma Middle where that's characterized by a lot of park, and there's just a tangle of vines. There's probably I think it was 200 affected trees in that whole area, and it's just not very obvious where the school boundaries and the park boundaries are. I think another thing that kind of emerged too was that at rental properties, these are multifamily apartment buildings, both small and large. I would suspect that there's a real lack of ownership by renters, and owners of those buildings probably don't invest in landscape contracts. They probably do the very bare minimum to maintain the grounds, and clearing vines off of trees is not one of those things that they do. So a lot of neglect at apartment buildings, and probably minimal investment. And there's also probably no social pressure. I think in the more neat and tidy areas of Takoma Park, there's probably some social pressure by neighbors, but I would suspect that at apartment buildings, you wouldn't find that quite so much. And I do think that, socialization really probably plays a major role here. But I do think it's interesting. Like I started the survey expecting, to be huge differences, class differences, and economic level differences. But I definitely saw that didn't, there were certainly affected trees throughout Takoma Park, in fancy neighborhoods, in less fancy neighborhoods, even well-kept yards in those so-called fancy neighborhoods are not immune to vine infestation. And that gets to what Mike was talking about earlier. So moving forward, it would seem that we could generate a lot of support for this kind of work, because if removing these vines and motivating the public to do something about this, if it can't be done in Takoma, it's unclear where it could be. I think we're starting from an envious position in terms of both the enabling environment, in terms of policy within Takoma, and having an educated and informed public. But that's not always the case, as Mike alluded to earlier. You get this disparity of people taking care of young trees, but letting their older trees die. And I put this picture here of a house, and not to shame the owner, but it says Ivy House on that sign, and their yard is completely covered in ivy. They're obviously very proud of their yard that's covered in ivy, but coincidentally, none of their trees were covered in ivy. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But back to Takoma, people here really love their trees for the most part. It's one thing that makes Takoma a vibrant, livable community. We have a stringent tree code, as many people who live here know. We also had a climate emergency that was declared here in Takoma Park, and which was followed by a sustainability and climate action plan, and then an emergency response resolution. In all of these documents, references are made to maintaining and expanding the tree canopy, which is good, but nothing is really said for how that should happen. There's also a new amendment to Takoma Code on noxious plants, but very little is there mentioned anything about those plants and how they affect trees. So I think that we probably have a supportive public. We definitely have a supportive enabling environment, but we really have to do more. And the city can start to educate the public on the threat of vines. And that's one thing that we're helping with, but we also need the city's help as well, because as I mentioned earlier, 74% of trees are on residential property, and we're not going to be able to get to all of those trees by ourselves. We really need to tell people about the threat, keep hammering that home, how people can address it. I think the city can remind people of their obligation to control those so-called noxious plants. I think enforcement is probably a last resort. I wouldn't want to see that happen initially, but I do think that the city can model good good forest management and good, urban canopy management by actually making sure that they take care of the vines that are on public property. And lastly, what we're doing is a volunteer corps, and we hope that we can spread this to other jurisdictions. We hope that it can serve as a model for other places. Just to before we ask questions and discuss, I just want to mention that I think Friends of Slagger Creek will play a huge role in this work moving forward. I'm going to be hoping to work closely with Friends of Sligo Creek in mobilizing both weed warriors and neighborhood tree stewards. So just to give an example, here in my neighborhood in the Long Branch Sligo neighborhood, which is also known as Between the Creeks, I'm surrounded by Montgomery Parkland, but I can't do all the work myself. I need people in my own neighborhood who can carry the message to neighbors and then can begin to help those neighbors remove the vines from their trees. And then I think lastly, Friends of Sligo Creek, we can help. I think Friends of Sligo Creek can help with the ongoing public education as it does on the threat of invasive vines, maybe even little notices in those boxes along Sligo Creek. I think that would be really cool. So yeah, that's our study in a nutshell. Happy to answer any questions. I'm sure I missed some things that Mike might be able to answer, or we can answer together.